Welcome to Chatting with David and Morris. Today we are honored to have Marilyn Chapman to chat with. And Morris, who listens to understand and not to respond, also is non-judgmental. So we look forward to this chat with Marilyn. And Marilyn, I'd like to begin by asking you to remember and share with us your growing up on a farm in Iowa.
Okay, David. The farm was located on the Iowa-Minnesota state line. The house was on the Iowa side. The barn was on the Minnesota side, so that's the near miss I came to being a very early Minnesota resident. But when I was 2 years old, my parents left farming, and my dad became an international harvester dealer in the town of Owine in northeastern Iowa. So that's where I grew up.
Did the Depression result in your family losing the farm, or what?
No, my parents rented a farm, but my father had payments to the owner of the farm and on shares. And during the 1930s, they had to borrow some money, and he borrowed it from his mother-in-law. She sent it to the bank in Lime Springs, Iowa, which was the town that they were near. And the money got to the bank, but not before the door locked. And so they lost $500 that was to pay their share for that particular quarter.
You know, that story is interesting because my family lost their farm also. And my father abandoned my mother with 6 children.
Wow.
She was a single parent, head of household, after my father deserted her. So I grew up without a father, but in a situation where we no longer had a family farm.
Right. My dad used to say when we were growing up, it was a good thing we were on the farm because we could at least eat what we couldn't sell.
Now, this was Depression times. What do you recall about those periods?
Well, I was born in 1932, and my brothers I had 2 older brothers, and they went to one-room schoolhouse and in Minnesota, I think, early on. And then I was only 2.5 years old when we moved to Owine, so I don't have a lot of farm-related stories, except when I was older and my grandparents moved to a farm outside of Owine. And so lots of my summers were spent on the farm with my grandmother, because my mother could get rid of me that way in the summer.
Did you ever milk a cow?
I tried, but I was never any good at it, thank you very much.
When I have listed here, you remember school. Were you in a one-room schoolhouse or what?
No, what I remember about school was coming out of the Depression. This would have been in Owine, and I remember that you could take 5 cents to school, and that would get you a carton of milk, and they had a milk break every morning. I also remember that prior to school opening, the 2 doctors in town would come to the school, and every kid from kindergarten through 6th grade got a cursory kind of exam from the doctor. He would check your heart and your eyes and your ears, and always concerned about your spine and whether or not you could stand up straight. They checked your feet, but this was all free, or it was paid for by the school board. And that's where inoculations against the vaccination, in particular for scarlet fever.
How about polio?
Well, polio was in the 50s, and this is ancient history, David, down to the 1930s. So polio vaccine wasn't available, but shots were mandatory.
Now, you grew up during the first part of World War II, and you indicated that your two brothers were in the military.
Yes, both of them. They were 8 and 10 years older than I was. My brother Royce had just started college, and he had to have his parents' permission at 19 years old to enlist in the Air Corps. And my other brother was 2 years older, and he wanted to enlist, but there was a weight limit, a lower weight limit, and he couldn't get to the 110 pounds or 120, whatever it was. So they would reject him. And because of that, the thing that boys did in order to get their weight up, they would try to eat bananas and water for the 12 hours before they had their physical exam, on the theory that it was supposed to make them heavier. And Bob's ended up in England and served in France, and Royce was a pilot, and he flew the hump. And they were both gone for about 2.5 years, but thankfully they came home.
Now, you graduated in 1950. Can you remember your preparation for advanced training, like college? Were the teachers in your high school preparing you for college?
There weren't the preparations that kids have today, that our grandchildren certainly have, or even that our daughter had. But the civics teacher, for instance, was the counselor for the whole senior class. Now, you're talking about a high school that only had a little over 300 students. My class was only 62 people. And so I would say, if you were a passing student and you could go in and talk to the counselor, and you would say, yes, my parents want me to go to college. And he'd look at your grade card and he'd say, what college do you want to go to? And then you could maybe have a brochure or something to look at, but there wasn't a lot of prep. And while the teachers were good, the length of time, for instance, for civics and world history was a semester of each one. So I also had a semester, not a year, but a semester of chemistry, and then a semester of physics. And the same thing was true for mathematics. And so you could have an algebra in 9th grade for a semester, and then advanced algebra when you were a sophomore. And that, I won't say it was a teacher shortage, but it was a way that small town managed the high school. So was I prepared for college? Not greatly, no.
How about expectations from your parents and the teachers? Because as a female, there oftentimes was a stereotype that females are not going on to college, or if they are, they're going into nursing. Did you experience that?
Either that or teaching. Neither Jess's parents nor mine went to college. They did want their kids to go, and they started my brothers, but the war interrupted. And when my brothers came home, they went into the family business rather than going back to school. So I came along a number of years later, and my parents wanted me to go to Iowa State College. Well, that's a very scientific, engineering-oriented school, and that is not me. And I had to find that out the hard way because I flunked a 5-hour physics course as a freshman, which doesn't do your grade point any good at all. So I took some tests at a counselor at the college, and it turned out I'm a liberal arts major, so I transferred to Iowa State Teachers College.
Now, where did you meet Jess?
I met him in November of my freshman year.
At Iowa State?
At Iowa State. He was a blind date, an alum to the fraternity, and his wife came to visit me, asked me how my social life was, and I said it was horrible. And so John left my phone number, and it circulated around the fraternity and ended up on Jess's desk. And he called, and
That's cute.
it went on from there.
You got married in March of 1953, is that right?
Right. Jess graduated in 1952, and after I transferred to Teachers College, I was taking an awful lot of hours trying to get to a teaching certificate. And so when that happened, when getting married happened, he had been in ROTC as an undergraduate. And the Korean War started in 1950, and in 1952, when he graduated, he had a job for with Procter & Gamble in Kansas City. But in October, the Army activated his commission, and so he was stationed in Fort Belvoir, Washington, D.C.
Virginia. Fort Belvoir, Virginia.
In Virginia, okay. And when a particular training was over, he was assigned to a base at Walters Air Force Base in Texas. And at that point in time, I was teaching kindergarten in Iowa, so the big joke in the family is he stopped on his way between Virginia and Texas and got married, which just about sums it up, because that wedding was put together in something like 10 days.
Now, after marriage and Jess got sent to Korea, where were you?
I continued to teach, not at the same place I taught my first year. I got a position teaching kindergarten closer to my parents' home, so that very often on weekends I went back home.
Now, when Jess returned, were you in Kansas City or where?
He went back to work for Procter & Gamble, but that only lasted a year, and then he decided he wanted an advanced degree, and he went back to Iowa State.
When did he start work for Eli Lilly?
Not until after he'd had a year and a half toward a master's in law and engineering. And he decided again that that wasn't what he wanted really to do, so he started interviewing. And Eli Lilly came to the Iowa State campus because they were in the agricultural business too at that point in time. And he took an interview, went to see him, and that was it. So in 1956, we moved to Indianapolis, and he worked there for 34 years.
Now, your daughter was born when?
She was born in 1957 in Indianapolis.
Then Jess took a position in London. Did you join him?
Oh, heavens, yes, David. What happened was an opportunity for transferring to the international division of Eli Lilly and Company occurred. And he and I flew to London to talk to the people in the London office about the job, and me to find out what it was really going to be like living in England. I was anxious to go.
Your daughter was with you?
Oh yeah. By this time, Lisa was 8.5 years old, and she was in 3rd grade. But she ended up in girls' school near in a village near where we lived. And so at the tender age of 12, she could speak 2 languages, knew all about the kings and queens and the history of Europe, but she knew nothing about pioneers and the Indian War. She knew nothing about American history at all.
Now, you say that you had a hard time locating a house when you were in London. How did you find one then?
It was Jess's job. When we went there together in November and he accepted the job, and then he had to go to work there in the office in 1966, January. So the theory was we had looked at houses while we were there, but we didn't go ahead and try to secure one. So he not only went to London with a new job, but his other job was to find us a house to live in. And that took 3 months. And he used to call and Lisa and I were back in Indianapolis. And he used to call once a week. And that was when, without all the high tech that we have today, you could hear the waves rolling on an international call because it was a cable across the Atlantic Ocean that was buried that brought telephone messages transatlantic.
What was your impressions of London?
I loved it after I got there. But Lisa and I had to register as aliens because Jess was working on a green card.
What's a green card?
A green card is temporary permission by the country that you are going to work in. I don't know what the details are, but anyway, he worked on a green card. And Lisa and I had to go register with the Tottenham Court Police Station. And this very brusque man who didn't like Americans very much, I think he was still mad from the Revolutionary War. But anyway, we had to answer 29 questions, and they said, if I behaved myself and living in the village of Stanmore, every year that we were in England, I was to go and register again at the Stanmore police station. And if I was good, Her Majesty would grant me permission to reside without all this rigmarole.
Now, your parents came to visit.
They came to visit, spend a month with us. Part of my ancestry is Welsh. And so we went to Wales and spent 3 wonderful days in the rain trying to find ancestral graves and touring castles. And then we took my parents to Scotland. The one thing I remember most about that whole period of time, which was about 4.5 years in London, was I was always meeting a train or a plane, either picking up Lisa or her dad, and or every free weekend or every spring break that Lisa had from school, we got to travel. So we made lots and lots of trips, and they were free from the kind of terrorism and restrictions that travel brings on today, but it was wonderful. And
How did your daughter adjust to that kind of environment, would you say? You ever have discussions with her about the times you...
Oh yes, she will tell you she hated sitting at the table at night when we'd have dinner in a restaurant someplace while her parents had coffee because it was boring. But she's taken her children to see where she went to school and where she lived, so she does have good memories of it.
Now, in 1970, you moved to Strasbourg.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
This was another, Lisa and I wait at home while Dad goes to work in a new place. He went to, part of his job in London was finding, land and working with local people because Lilly was expanding and building capsule plants, or they were going into partnership with pharmaceutical companies already in Europe. So he had been working in France, flying back and forth looking for land. And they finally found some outside of Strasbourg, and he went there. He became director of manufacturing. And he went in January of 1970. And it wasn't until school was out in England that Lisa and I could move. And there was a company apartment we were to move into, but those people the husband was going back to Indianapolis and his kids were in school in Strasbourg, so we couldn't have the apartment. So everybody was backed up, and Lilly women very often used to say it would be easier to keep the women and children in place and just pass the men through. Because it was hurry up, go to work, and then the rest of us waited.
And your daughter went to the French school there?
And she went to a French girls' school, yes.
So she spoke fluent French?
She learned to speak French in her English school, and she had a year of German. And of course, Strasbourg was right on the Rhine River and had been a part of Germany and or France, thrown back and forth since the First World War. So to speak German and French was very good, but she was 12 years old and she wouldn't often bail out her mother, who just was no good at language whatsoever.
Now, you went back to Indianapolis in 1971.
Yes.
Where did you stay there?
In Indianapolis?
Yeah.
We bought a home off Allisonville Road, and Lisa went into 9th grade, and then she graduated from North High School.
Now, you spent more than 5 years in Europe with extensive travel. Give us some idea what you did during those 5 years. And your daughter went with you, I assume, when you traveled.
Oh yeah, the three of us did. You want a triptych of all the places we went?
Yeah, that would be nice.
I think there's a picture right here. And it's of Switzerland, which is my favorite place in the whole world. If I run away, that's where you'll find me.
Okay.
And a lot of our trips were fly to the country, rent a car, and then do the big cities, the museums, and this was all arranged by a travel agent in London, so we were very fortunate to be able to spend a lot of those times.
Let's shift gears and move you to China. What was the attraction there, and what year was it that Jess took a job in China?
Well, let's see, 1988. China was just trying to enter the world of commerce and what have you. And a letter came from a Chinese visiting professor from Indiana University, Dr. Weibark. And they were the letter indicated that the Chinese government was looking for professionals to come and work with their young people in various professions such as construction, medicine, farming,
Factory management.
and management, right. Because a whole generation had not been able to access those professions. And so they were inviting people from all over the world to come. We met a man, what they wanted was just to come and lecture to young people who were being trained to be managers in turnkey factories small factories. And we also, when we went there, it took 3 months of just writing notes because he was to lecture, and there was to be an interpreter standing beside him interpreting what he said to the young people in class.
So what was your role?
To sit and wait for the class to be over, and on the half days, when he wasn't, we got to travel around China, around Beijing, to the Western Hills and to the Great Wall of China.
What do you remember about Mr. Liu, who was your interpreter? Capital L-U.
Capital L-U, Mr. Liu. He had a son who was Sean Lee, who traveled with us on a Sunday when we went out into the countryside. And they left me with this young boy who was 5 years old in this big park. Jess went off to take pictures. Mr. Liu went off to buy us some tickets to go and see something particular in that park. And I had Sean Lee on my lap. I think there's a picture. And so Chinese people would come up to me and put their hand over their mouth and laugh and then point at me. And after that, Sean Lee became uncomfortable and he started crying and yelling, "Papa, Papa, Papa." He wanted his dad, and he was stuck with this American woman he didn't know. It was terrible.
You think you were discriminated against by the Chinese?
No, I just think there were not many Americans walking around the parks and the streets, so.
With a 5-year-old Chinese?
Especially that. This is the book that, as Jess took notes and snail mailed, way back then, his notes on his lectures got translated into Chinese. And this is the result. This was the workbook for the students who were learning to become managers of factories.
That's cool.
Yeah. We met another man while we were there who was from Chicago Bridge, helping them with highway construction and bridge construction. We also met another, a Frenchman actually, who was an architect, and he was working on bridges. So China got a lot of help from around the world.
2 left.
Share with us, Marilyn, your travels in China briefly.
2 minutes.
It started in Beijing. We were there 8 days. We had a driver, and he would take me to shop, but he stayed with me, and we didn't know the currency, and I didn't know the language, so that kind of didn't work. We had a lot of banquets. I ate a lot of duck.
Did you use chopsticks?
I learned to use chopsticks. Their food is cooked and cut so it's easy. American food isn't easy to eat with chopsticks.
You mean Kentucky Fried Chicken?
Yeah, especially Kentucky Fried Chicken. We also went to Xi'an to see the soldiers that were uncovered. Terracotta warriors, yeah, with about 1 million other people. Then he also had lectures set up in Shanghai, and there we were housed in a dormitory on a college campus. It had been a Methodist college established in the 1920s, or probably in 1900 to 1920s, and now the church was a warehouse. But that's the way it was.
Reflecting on your travels, how many countries have you visited?
Jess wanted to belong to the Century Club, and he got to 78 countries that he either put his foot in or landed on or visited or lived in.
Wow.
Now, my number isn't quite that high. In fact, I don't even think I've counted them. But we were very fortunate to be able to do a lot of traveling.
And you mentioned that your favorite spot was Switzerland. Tell
Yes.
us about Switzerland and why you would go back.
We did a lot of hiking with small groups out of Tucson. And two of the trips that we made to Switzerland were hiking trips. Jess hiked, I walked. They would hike for 6 hours a day. And I would go 1 or 2 stops, and then I would catch a gondola and take a walk and meet them later.
Briefly tell us how you arrived at Boutwell's.
Oh, that's a good one. We arrived at Boutwell's because our daughter and her family had lived in various places in the U.S., but in the year 2000, they moved to Oak Park Heights. And our grandchildren were in middle school and high school. We were living in Tucson, and we were coming to see them in the summer, or we were flying to come in for holidays. And the travel back and forth by car got old, and we were missing out on many good years with the kids
How
and
many grandchildren?
2 grandchildren and now 2 great-granddaughters. But they were the reason that we came here. And I think that's true for a lot of residents of Boutwell's.
And your first residence was in
Building A when it was new in 2004.
Wow.
So we've been here 17 years, yes. We're the only people I know who went from an apartment to a house and then back to an apartment.
And all of the travels, you said Switzerland, and you would go back there. Have you gone back there? Switzerland, have you gone back to Switzerland since you've been in the States?
Oh, yes, very definitely. When he retired to Tucson, he played tennis and/or joined a small hiking group. And those trips we made were made during his retirement, and we both went. And it's just a fascinating country. We also happened to be on a trip that was sponsored by Elder Hostel, which is now called Road Scholar, on 9/11. And we saw the towers going down on television just before dinner on September 11th. It was really crushing.
To conclude, you've been very active in Boutwell's, like in the archive program. Tell us about that.
The archive program began many years ago, where residents are asked if they would like to talk about their life, and then a CD is made, and it is given to them, and/or they can order more for a family.
How many have you interviewed?
Too many to count. I think the last, I'm by far not the most. I think Ray and David Spencer have a higher rate than I do, but I think the last time I counted it was 21 or 23. But those CDs are available in the library, and I'm kind of disappointed that more people don't take them out. But I know that CDs and getting a CD player
A lot of them don't have them anymore.
don't have them, and so it's difficult. So we're putting them on the in-house Boutwell station, and we hope people are listening on Tuesdays at 2:00.
Yay! Say goodbye. Say thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Goodbye.
Thanks, David. You finally got me in front of a microphone.
Good job, Marilyn.
Oh.